Welcome to the Critical Media Studies Podcast. We're your hosts, Mike Rapici
and Barry Falk.
Hello, Michael. How are you this morning?
Oh, Barry, I'm doing very well. How are you?
I'm doing well. We're going down memory lane in our pre-show here, and so we're giddy happy to talk about the prospects of recording by Glenn Gould today, a 1966 essay. And should we say something? Why don't you start off by saying one or two things, and I'll add one or two things about Glenn Gould and who he was.
Sure.
And then we'll talk about and then we'll talk about what we're going to talk about in regard to this essay.
Yeah. So Glenn Gould is a Canadian pianist, classical pianist, who, as I understand it, basically performed one evening. I think it was at the Hollywood Bowl, or in Los Angeles. Stood up from his piano at the end of the performance, walked off stage, and just never came back.
You got it. You got it.
He was basically, as I understand it, live performance was just something that he hated. And so he was drawn to recording. And at the time, this was not the thing, right? Live music was how we can consume,
especially in terms of the classical repertoire. The classical repertoire, as you know, and we've seen shadows of this or traces of this. This is the assumptions of all the Adorno pieces that we've been talking about.
It is. So
yeah.
I was gonna say. So we've got a loose cannon, if you will.
We have a loose cannon. Thank you. You mentioned the dramatic episode. I'll just add a couple things to this. So, and just talk about the larger context of what's going on. You mentioned the most important part of the larger context, which is that Gould, in saying, I don't want to do live performance anymore, in swearing off or in leaving a performing career and embracing the studio. I'm sorry.
I was just gonna say, but this is a statement, or a question disguised as a statement here. He was still very prolific after he walked away.
Oh, it was and that
This was not the end of a career. This was just a very abrupt change in direction from live performance to studio performance. So was he one of the? I'm guessing he was.
Yeah, let's underscore that, Michael, before we go on. The retreat, or I use the word retreat, which you're right, is misleading. His refusal to do performance did not signal with a complete withdrawal from the public eye. In fact, he became more celebrated.
Right.
So you were going to say?
No, I said that was my my 3 cents for the intro.
Oh, okay. Well, then just add a couple things to it, just to set up some context for this particular essay. It seems to, now I'm not a Gould scholar, and I'm not that well versed in the biography, but it seems to have been like, so this essay was written in 1966, and it's about the prospects of recording. And there seemed to be a couple things going on here. There seemed to have been biographical reasons. Gould was an eccentric. I think, I say that with love. He was given to gesticulations and he was given a lot to singing. One of the reasons he was such an unorthodox performer, besides having stage fright, he also was a very unorthodox performer. He would often sing. In fact, on the recordings, you can hear him singing along with his playing. And there were many listeners who would say he's an incredible pianist, but I wish he wouldn't sing. And he performed with gloves, and he insisted on temperature control. So there were a lot of personal idiosyncratic reasons for his frustration and eventual, motivating his farewell to live performance. But I'm sorry. Yeah,
I'm sorry to interrupt.
Sure.
I just want to make a quick correction. His last performance was in Los Angeles at the Wilshire Ebel Theater. Not that's where it was. I just wanted to correct real quick.
I didn't notice you. Did you mention the theater?
I think I said the Hollywood Bowl or something.
I don't know why that's in my Hollywood Bowl. You're thinking
why that's in my head, but it was.
You know what? You're thinking of the Beatles, and you read my mind because about to bring up the Beatles for a very obvious reason here. So there's a symbiosis or a synergy going on at the same time. There are personal reasons why he wants to take leave of live performance. And he's kind of an eccentric character. So there's that. But there's also, as he details in this essay, all these he's an intellect, and he styles himself not just a performer but kind of a musical intellectual and a general intellectual. And I can bring up McLuhan because there is a kind of Toronto media studies, communication studies, pro science, thinking about the relationship. There are a lot of thinkers, McLuhan among them, who are thinking of new ways about the interface between science and the humanities, technology and art. And Gould positions himself, he's reading those people, and he's positioning himself within this particular kind of circuit. So this particular essay is important for us to talk about because what we're going to end up talking about is the media environment. One last, and with that, we can start talking about the major themes of the episode. But allow me one brief excursus of the Beatles, since you mentioned the Hollywood Bowl. Notice how I bring things in here for no reason. But I think the Beatles are relevant in this case because I was speaking of synergy. So there are these personal reasons, but there are also these intellectual reasons that he kind of adumbrates and elaborates on in this essay that we'll talk about. Why he feels that recording is the future. And in fact, one of the powerful, impactful statements of this essay is, I think, Gould is prescient in thinking, hey, not only is recording important, and the aspects or the prospects of recording fortuitous and full of the future, in a way the revolution has already happened. Recording has already changed our relationship to our environment. And another way in which he sort of Gould speaks of or shows his kinship, personal and just kind of synergistically part of the time, with McLuhan, is that he's thinking of music in an environmental way. I think that's what we're going to end up talking about, that he thinks of music as a media environment, and the medium, recording, totally recharges, reformats, replatforms, redoes everything in our relationship to music. So the technology is not incidental to our relationship with music, it's primary. And what he's announcing in this essay is the future that's already happened in regarding to the ways in which recording is reformatted our experience, the ways in which we interact with musical environment. Quickly on the Beatles. In terms of the synergy, the ways in which its essay hooks up with the times. I can't help but mention two parallels with the Beatles that I think are very directly, they seem directly relevant to Glenn Gould, although Glenn Gould doesn't, I haven't been able to find any place where Glenn Gould reflects on it. But this was also the year in which the Beatles are forced to stop doing what was also unheard of for a rock band or any commercial. It was unheard of for a concert pianist to say, I don't want to play concerts anymore. How much more absurd it is that that a popular music band all of a sudden refuses to tour. Now, different reasons. There are social, basically it's the kind of hysteria, Beatlemania, fan mania, audience mania, however you call it, that motivates the Beatles' refusal to tour. It's not a principled, but this is where it weirdly synergizes or overlaps with Gould. The Beatles are kind of forced into this position of giving up touring. Because it just becomes so impossible for them to perform under the circumstances because they can't hear themselves.
Right.
What's the situation? If you're a musician, you can't hear yourself on stage. It's the most frustrating thing in the world. So they're forced into this situation. But weirdly enough, one of the things that the nexus of this essay. There are personal reasons why Gould thinks it's a good idea to take a hiatus from concert performance. But he also feels there are intellectual and aesthetic reasons, real reasons to embrace the new future that has already happened in recording. The Beatles end up doing this too. It is, to me, an incredible coincidence or synergy that 1960. So what's the Beatles' reaction to being forced to not perform? They embrace the studio process with a vengeance. And I'm not even talking about 1967 Sergeant Pepper, which is the absolute product of the fact that they can't tour anymore. So they are exiled into the studio. But even in 1966, beginning in 1966, the year this essay was published, is this some sort of weird news sources synergy? It gotta be. Beginning with this year, the Beatles' Revolver is the first album where the studio process, where the medium is the message. The tape loops, the tape splice is something that Glenn Gould goes on
We'll
and
talk
on
about that. Yeah.
Yeah, the tape loop, the tape splice, the studio recording process. The fact that, as Gould also talks about, that what happens in the recording process is that musicians become listeners to their performance, and they're able to fine tune they were able to alter the tape because they have gained a new literacy and comfort level and competence in evaluating and measuring their performance on tape. That's the Beatles in 1966.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think any of this is coincidental.
I guess that's what I'm saying. Synergy is the best way.
Yeah, I think
It's
that
not idiosyncratic to him. There's a way in which he's tapping into the zeitgeist when he
no, the
says
reason I think that it feels strange to look at this and say, oh my God, what's happening, is really more I think the result of genre than anything else, because you don't think of the musical environment surrounding classical music as really being terribly compatible with the environment around rock and roll. But the I think the reality is, right, like, these tools are available, and as they become more understood, they're going to afford the same opportunities regardless of genre. The question then is, how do you want to use it? One of the things that well, I'm going to hold on to that. Actually, let's jump in. I think
let's jump. Okay, what I didn't do in this long excursus is I didn't say the two major themes. Let's do that before we begin. The two major themes that we're going to talk about and elaborate on from the essay.
Right. There's a fair bit. I found this one. So with a lot of the stuff that we've discussed, we discussed a lot of high theory, which most of you listening are probably familiar with, and in many cases have read. Gould was an interesting step away from that, because I've never thought of him. I'm familiar with him as a pianist, but I've never thought of him as an intellectual before. And so I just want to say this was a really enjoyable sort of step out. I found it very lucid, very thoughtful, very thought-provoking,
very thoughtful,
but also not a very difficult read. And that's not to say that it's simple, but this was a fairly, I'll just say it was a lucid read, which is not always the case. But there are essentially two arguments. There's an argument 1 and an argument 1A that we're going to talk about today. And the first one, obviously all of them around the technology of recording. But the first thing the thread that he's really playing with is the argument that recording is the technology that leads to the creation of the listener, right? This is, as much as it produces an archival artifact, this is really about creating a listener as opposed to the concert goer. And it shifts the music industry.
Underscore that, Michael. Emphasize that if you can, or rather, I want to slow down because I think you said something really important, like a bullet point that we can think about. It's a kind of what you're talking. You are suggesting that and I totally agree with you, that one of the central points of the essay is that there's a new listener that's being created in opposition to the concert goer. So can we
Mhm.
talk a little bit? I don't want to interrupt your
Yeah, well, let me
your
just
thought, but
let's just get the two
all
points that
right,
were, so the listener
sure,
is the first one,
sure.
and the second one, which I think as we unpack the
Okay,
listener and all of the baggage that comes with the
okay.
creation of this new entity, is that recording also creates background music, which is something very different than the music that is heard in a live state. So those are arguments 1 and 1A here, is the creation of the listener and the creation of
And the
background
new
music.
meaning and the new functionality of background music. Those are the two
Well,
things
yeah,
we're
but also
talking
I think the functionality and
about.
positioning of the listener. I mean, these are two
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah,
really revolutionary
yeah.
creations that we get in addition to the actual, artifact or the archive, the archival artifact that is the record.
Mhm.
So let's jump into, I guess, we'll start with point A, the listener. You
Well, why don't you? Because I think because you already brought it up. This is what I was mentioning. This is was my point to you earlier. Um, you were suggesting that there is a kind of difference that Gould is talking about between the listener and the concert goer. Why don't you elaborate on that?
Yeah, so in how do I want to say it? Pre-recording, right? Music is consumed in a concert hall, which is spectacle. Right? You dress up, it is an event. You
Mhm.
go. The focus is on the musician, or excuse me, on the musician, who is producing the music, right? The listener, as a participant in this little network, is passive and is
Right.
focused on the performer. What happens when we have recorded music, and this is something that Adorno talked about, um,
Mhm.
is that the dynamics of everything change, right? The center point, the focus of this shifts now squarely to the listener. And the environment has changed, obviously. This is no longer the massive performative event that
Mhm.
live music would be. This is something consumed in the home. But I think the really interesting aspect of this that Gould plays with is that the listener with recorded music is now an active agent. It's not just the recipient of the music.
Mhm.
This person now gets to determine what we're going to hear, when we're going to hear it, how we're going to hear it, what it's going to sound like. It's
Mhm.
the listener now becomes part producer in addition to just listener.
Mhm.
And so that shift really, really upsets sort of the hierarchical ordering of music, music performance, music consumption, um, and empowers a previously fully
Yeah.
passive participant.
Michael, as you were talking about the listener, I had a little bit of a flashback to Adorno and his point about one of the peripheral, or it's weird. It's both main and peripheral effects of the experience of listening to records in the home. There's a way in which, and Adorno talks about this, and he's not necessarily critical of it, even though the form in which this, the platform for this is the commodification of records, the record industry. That's the necessary platform for this. But Adorno notes the ways in which um, the listener is trained in a way and sort of led to a new experience with music, and a new familiarity with music, and gets used to some of the audio aspects of audiophile listening. And they get, I think the word he uses, and that Gould also uses, is intimacy. In a way, bringing the music in the home, the experience of sound recordings accessed at the time of your choosing rather than the scheduled time of the concert performance, One of the effects on that is it increases it augments our affective relationship to music. We hear it differently. We experience it with we become literally more familiar with it. It becomes more friendly, it becomes, we incorporate it in our consciousness. And this is something I want. So that's an important part of the training of the listener. And one last comment on that, because you were talking about the listener in terms of agency, the new agency of the listener. And one of the things we're going to discuss are the ways in which the listener, once they gain this new literacy, they're going to make new demands on music and on the musical environment. But I think it's also important to stress the McLuhan-esque aspect of Gould's argument. And what do I mean by that? McLuhan's message, of course, is the medium is the message. And one of the things that means is our interactions with the platforms, yes, we have agency over that, but in a way, the platform always is restructuring our brain. Always the platform has our tools exert some control, according to the theorists you talk about, a lot of control. There's a lot of control over ourselves. So there's a way in which the media, we are conscious, both conscious of our media environment, but also we're largely unconscious, according to McLuhan, of our media environment. Nevertheless, in those unconscious interactions with technology, we are still being trained. So that aspect of McLuhan, I really find there in Gould, that in a way, yes, we're talking about it. We're trying to make conscious and elaborate the meaning of the experience we have when we interact with music in our home environment. But McLuhan's point, Adorno's point, Gould's point is just interacting with this technology, even if you don't articulate a theory about it, even if you're not fully conscious of it, you're nonetheless trained and enlightened and taken to a new level by your constant interactions with the tech.
One of the other things that's interesting, and Gould points this out, but I want to jump in here. I hope this isn't too much of a derailment, but McLuhan makes the argument that there's always a generational lag in understanding. And one of the things that Gould brings up about the impact of recorded music is that it really enables this like Janus looking perspective, right? Where we can, obviously the future is going to change, but it also brings the past. It destroys chronology. It brings the past
Destroys
up.
chronology, right?
And
right.
so I think it's an interesting fit with McLuhan when you say, hey, it's going to take a generation to understand things. It doesn't make that point invalid, but what it does is it brings the entirety of recorded music to the present.
And that's part of the literacy and competency and education.
Exactly. And so whether
right.
it's a conscious decision or not, is almost irrelevant, because what it's doing is it's bringing the entire history of recorded music to the present. And by engaging with all of that music, with all that content, we will be forced to look at it through a perspective that's different. One of the things that's interesting that when I was reading this, that I kept struggling with is I was like, I don't understand why he's so concerned with recording and the live music. He never talks about the fact that all of this music is still a written language. And wouldn't we have access to the sheet music, for example? Like, why is it that we can't just go and look at the sheet music and read the sheet music and there's your music? And, okay, so sometimes I'm a little slow with picking things up. I don't always get things the first go round, but I was like, wow, this is as much a question of style as it is about access to the content. So if your average person can't read sheet music or doesn't have access to sheet music, so on one hand, it's about access, right? Like it's a lot easier to flip on the radio or flip on the turntable or do whatever. But it's also very much an issue of style, about the reimagining of music, about being in the event that you are a performer, about the being self-reflexive without having removing ego, essentially, and just being able to look at things objectively. It's a really sort of fascinating intellectual experience to sort of reimagine what's already been done, not for what it says, but for what it means and for how it's interpreted. So, one of the arguments that he makes in here is that music journalists are organized, they're assigned chronologically, like this is your time period, this is your time period, much like in academia,
The
yeah, yeah,
reviewer
yeah,
in the classical
right,
music
much like
periodicals.
in academia, you have a time period that you work in, and
You're
then
a
this person,
specialist in the borough.
right? So this really frustrates and complicates that, but forces us to look at things that have already been done through how it's done now. I mean, it would be really interesting, for example, to look. I mean, I don't know. I guess a literary example. It's like, what happens if you take Oliver Twist, right, and redo that now? Well, with music, it's like I guess I'm trying to. God, I was going somewhere interesting to me with this. Like, it affords you the opportunity to not just read the book, but watch the movie. You have the interpretation of the text, and that enables a different kind of evolution. If all you have is the source material, if I can just read the notes, I don't know how it's played. I don't know the tempo with which it's played. So it brings a much deeper understanding. I'm not saying we have to go anywhere with that idea, but it was just, I struggle with, like,
Well,
why are we not talking about the written
well,
form here?
I have two comments on that. My explanation of why we're not so much talking about the written form, beyond the fact that he assumes that kind of literacy among most of his audience, or especially the musicians in his audience, I actually thought this was yet another resonance with Adorno, because you remember in the form of the phonograph record, there's a startling moment at the end of that essay where he basically says, in a way, the phonograph, after bagging on the phonograph record and saying, well, it's a commercial event and there are advertisements for it. What more do you need to know about a recording, and that you can advertise the recording before the recording is out? That tells you how capitalist it is. Nonetheless, he ends with this moment and says, that he has a Benjaminian moment at the end where he says, you know what? This technology has just liberated music completely, because now the text becomes the recording and not the written score. Right. So, I mean, I think that's the reason why he's talking about the prospects of recording. And I think he realizes, though he doesn't make an Adorno-esque, deal out of it, but maybe because he just assumes that what Adorno thought was a cataclysmic, in a good way, a cataclysmic event. He just assumes that one of the ways in which recording is a total game changer is that the emphasis is now the archive. You're talking about the archive. The archive is now the recording as much as the written transposition of the recording. So I think that's one of the things that's going on. Do you have a comment to that, or I wanted to say something about history since you brought it up?
No, let's talk about history.
That's one of the, we could go endlessly. We want to talk about background music and some other things about the essay, but if we had yet another episode, and we don't want to be too tiresome and laborious for listeners, but more than we always are, but we could do the entire episode of this concept of history, because his concept, or the concept of history, you mentioned that music recording alters our perception of history and increases our literacy, but it does a lot of other things with our perception of history in general. It does away, as you mentioned, with chronology. I find, and in fact, maybe this is a weakness of the essay, but I sympathize with him if it is, because I do feel that he presents this really troubling, very interesting, but troubling paradox. He presents our new relationship to history in a paradoxical way, that I don't know if he realizes it's as troubling. I don't know if he realizes all the implications of what he's saying. So, as you mentioned, let me retrace my steps and see if I can make this a little bit clearer. As you mentioned, one of Gould's major points is that having access to record all of recording history, to all the permutations of a text, including including adaptations of Oliver Twist, as well as Oliver Twist.
Right.
That having access to all these permutations of the text increases our consciousness and increases our historical awareness. What does it mean to increase your historical awareness of music? It makes you aware both simultaneously of your differences. In a way, he says, one of the meanings of the recording archive undoes chronology. One of the points of that is that you live in a greater familiarity with the musical text because you're studying it up and down. You can isolate it as a text, and you can isolate it as a recording, and you can rethink it. You have a new way of interacting with it. But another thing, there's another passage in there where he talks about where I think this whole business of living without chronology has disturbing implications that Gould doesn't actually get, because there's a way in which he says we're never able, despite the new familiarity we have with musical history, we're still incredibly subjective and biased in our relationship with the past. And in fact, what happens is there's this one passage. I don't know if I'll just reference it here. I won't take the time to read it. But you might recall this, Michael. There's this one passage where he talks about the fact that we're incredibly biased listeners to the archive of music because we know the musical forms that stand up to our ears.
Mm-hmm.
And the recorded archive allows us I'll use a pop music example that at least clarifies this for me. If you're interested in indie rock, the Velvet Underground has a very particular sound. They're an example of a band that in the 1960s and 70s had very little repercussions. By the 80s and 90s, because you have all these bands, REM, or countless other bands that are trying to sound like the Velvet Underground and they have their own particular take on the minimalist musical arrangement of the Velvet Underground. There's a way in which that becomes the template for a kind of not punk rock sound, but for an indie rock sound. Okay, now you're in 2023. It's almost impossible for you to, when you hear the Velvet Underground now, you don't think, wow, that sounds disturbing. No, you think, that sounds like REM.
Mm-hmm.
There are ways in which the subsequent history, the fact that you're making sense of history using the archive, that doesn't necessarily mean you're reaching you're reaching an objective position.
No.
In regard to this history. Actually, you are still imprisoned within your subjectivity in this new historical consciousness.
So we had talked beforehand about how archiving allows sort of the reevaluation, right?
Right.
And the understanding. And I had mentioned to you earlier about how the example, I think the Velvet Underground is a good example of this. But I had mentioned how you look at the reaction to gangster rap in the 90s. And if you look at it now, it strikes it just sounds different now than it did then. Somebody had shown me.
When you say it sounds different, do you mean that our reaction to the controversy sounds different? Okay.
Yes. Yeah.
So
Obviously,
not necessarily the music, not necessarily.
No. So but that's the point, right? Like you have a recording that is identical to what was heard when it was originally released. So on one hand, what you hear is exactly what you heard when everybody was freaking out because the release of Cop Killer was going to be the end of civilization, right? So the actual music is identical. There is no difference. But you approach it, you receive it now with a very different set of eyes and a very different moment. And that moment influences profoundly what that music means.
Mm-hmm.
So there was some, this was a little while ago, but somebody had shown me one of those little, I don't know if it's, I don't really follow this carefully, but I don't know whether it was a TikTok or an Instagram video, whatever the social media platform was, but it was a guy who was saying, you know, it was one of those, what I hear, what my kids hear things. And it was funny because I think it was Baby Got Back was the song he was listening to. And so there's a clip of him hearing it. And I think this, I mean, it resonated with me, not the Baby Got Back so much because it's not really my style, but he's listening to it and he's in his car and he's just jamming out to it. Right. And then there was the what my kids hear moment. And it was the exact same music, but it was set to like slow jazz or smooth jazz. So the lyrics are exactly the same. Right. But the interpretation is like, oh my God, that's my dad's music.
Yeah.
And it will always, therefore, belong on a smooth jazz station. So the same thing is always like history. I think you look at the music in its moment and you say, okay, this is what it was in its historical moment. This is what it was. But again, since recordings obliterate chronology, right, you can take that same thing now and you will always see it with very different eyes. And I think this is an interesting, or unless you want to add to this, I think this is a good point to jump into background music.
Well, let me just try. I'm going to try to undo some of the damage I did with my long rambling comment because your comment allows me to sort of compress what I was trying to say because you gave a really precise example of it. A more compact version of what I was trying to say would have it that Gould is sometimes confuses greater historical awareness with greater objectivity about music history. And I think actually his argument is a little bit darker and a little bit more nihilistic even about history or the possibility of actually engaging real quote unquote history.
Okay. I think that's it, you know, and but the other thing is there's a lot of value in that, right? Like
value in the history argument or his critique of history. I would certainly agree.
Yeah, both. I mean, it enables us. So you know, let's jump into the background music portion of this.
Sure.
I think we come full circle. So the second argument that we're going to focus on is about music, recorded music functioning as background music. And I think at this point, Barry, it's probably a good idea for us to actually jump into the text a little bit. And as I was rereading it, there was one moment, and maybe this is a good bridge to where we are. I want to read this one section because he makes it's a quick moment, but I think it's interesting. And you and I haven't talked about this yet. So this is here we go. This is my turn to put those moments. Okay. But he says, in my opinion, the most important of the missing links in the evolution of the listener, consumer, participant, as well as the most persuasive argument for the stylistic mix, is to be found in that most abused of electronic manifestations, background music. This next sentence is what really caught my eye today. This much criticized and often misunderstood phenomenon is the most productive method through which contemporary music can confine its objectives to a listening, consuming, music-absorbing society. So I want to come back to that in a second, but I'll just finish this argument here. Cunningly disguised within the bland formula from which background sounds are seemingly concocted is an encyclopedia of experience, an exhaustive compilation of the cliches of post-Renaissance music. Moreover, this catalog provides a cross-referenced index which permits connections between stylistic manifestations with fine disregard for chronological distinction. Within 10 minutes of restaurant music, one can encounter a residue of Rachmaninoff or a blast of Berlioz proceeding without embarrassment from the dregs of Debussy. Indeed, all the music that has ever been can now become background music against which the impulse to make listeners supplanted connections is the new foreground. So
beautiful passage to have checked.
Yeah. So the argument there's many arguments in here. One, right, is that because we're jumping all over, we can jump all over the place without regard for chronology. The listener and the listener's ability to connect to anything comes front and center. But the line that I found most interesting, right, this much criticized and often misunderstood phenomenon is the most productive method through which contemporary music can confine its objectives.
Okay.
This argument that music, despite its role as a background presence, has an agenda. I find that very, very fascinating.
I'm going to stop you though for a second.
Yeah.
Whose agenda?
Well, so as I read this, it's subtle, but I think the argument works as you tease it out, that music itself has, and maybe agenda is not the right word, but it has a sense. And okay, and I'm also going to just sort of pause and acknowledge the fact that I have a background in new materialism, and that's going to play here, right? But that the music itself has an agenda. And I don't mean that in some sort of manipulative sense, but what I'm saying here is that we've talked at length today about being able to return to recorded music and see it with a fresh set of eyes. I think that what Gould is saying here is that, yes, you will return to something with whatever your current eyes and your current framework may be, but that you are also observing and interrogating something that comes from a particular framework, that what we are looking at is not this benign blank canvas that we get to color on with whatever sort of contemporary crayons we may be carrying with us, that this is always going to be a reinterpretation of a past that had a perspective.
Oh yeah, Michael, but
and that perspective is value laden. It's not how do I want to say this? It's not just an empty vessel. That the music we hear has a perspective. And so this background music, or just forget the background perspective for a point for a moment, that this return to an earlier time forces us to reconsider a historical moment, and whether we're conscious of it or not. I mean, again, this is a bit of retread, but I thought this was fascinating that he says music can confide its objectives.
It is interesting that he says that, but the more you speak on it, I think we have a difference here that would be productive to discuss.
Sure. I'll give you an example while you're casting about for ways to shoot this little air balloon.
No, I don't want to shoot it down. Yes, go ahead.
This. I'll go back to my example of Gangster.
I was just trying to find the exact passage about music.
This is 3 pages.
That one sentence where he gives music these attributes. Because what I was going to say is, I think I'm going to connect this to what I was saying a moment ago about Gould pretending at points that we have more control over the past than perhaps his premises would allow. So, for example, in your statement that music has an objective, music has an agenda, and more specifically, that's his statement. Your statement, Michael, was that music, that the past has an agenda that's different from ours. The past is no longer an empty vessel. Actually, I would argue quite the contrary. I think what Gould really is saying, despite himself, maybe he doesn't quite realize he's saying this, is that the past is an empty vessel. And what recording allows us to do is to play with it infinitely and reformat it infinitely. And part of that learning and training it's doing on the listener, a lot of it is Yes, the listener is becoming more conscious and more aware of history, but that history is simultaneously being erased by the vagaries and wills and agencies of all powerful listener.
I
So I think
think
it's kind of the contrary of what you were
I
saying.
think there's room for
Okay.
both of us here because I
Okay.
I
Tell me more.
I
And
I
I
make
interrupted your example. Maybe you
no,
want to
no,
go
no,
to
no,
your
no.
example.
I make sense of the world based on the premise that there is nothing that is rhetorically vacant, right? Everything is
Mhm.
making an argument. And so if we go back to the example of Cop Killer for a moment, okay?
Okay.
That was and I use this because I think it's an extreme example. And I
Yes.
know that this is very much in your wheelhouse musically, right? So
Exactly. Of
absolutely.
course. When
So
people think of 90s hip hop, they do
they
think
think of Barry Falk.
they think of it,
I've
especially
got the
West Coast,
I've got the
especially
t-shirt.
West Side, Best Side.
So
Absolutely.
um that was a historical moment. That
Uh-huh.
song, I think, was an attempt to encapsulate all sorts of rage and discontent with a system that was perceived to be corrupt.
Hmm.
Okay.
Mhm.
And those feelings and sentiments are encoded musically, right? The tone, the tenor, the language, all of it, all of these disparate elements of music come together to make a
Mhm.
social statement.
Mhm.
And when we listen to it now,
Mhm.
it is a musical artifact as much as it is a social artifact.
Mhm.
And through the ability to edit, through the ability to, change the way that we
Mhm.
see it, we can come up with different versions of this. But the fact remains that the musical recording now is going to, despite the fact that it sounds exactly the same, it's going to hit
Mhm.
differently. We're going to interpret it
Mhm.
differently. We're
Mhm.
going to see the 90s and the,
Mhm.
sort of white Republican response to gangster rap
Mhm.
as a maybe an overreach, maybe the beginning of the end, like it's going to again depend on your perception of it, but
Uh-huh.
it's not devoid of meaning. I can't go there with that.
It's not devoid of meaning, Michael, but I find it interesting in all your references to Cop Killer, you haven't mentioned anything about the tonalities of the song. You've mentioned nothing about the recording itself. What does that mean?
I don't follow. What do you mean? What does that mean?
Have you talked about how it sounds like? Have you talked about the form,
Well, the
the
form
musical
is
form? What I'm saying is that you're saying the recording has changed meaning now, but you haven't made any references to the recording. You just
mm-hmm,
mentioned the title of the recording.
mm-hmm,
You mentioned nothing about the vocal performance. You mentioned nothing about the song itself. You mentioned nothing about the arrangement. You mentioned
mm-hmm.
nothing about you've mentioned nothing about the music. What
Okay.
does that mean? What does that mean that you haven't?
Well,
Or is that significant?
it's static, right? Like the recording is
So the recording, well, no, this I'm not criticizing you. I'm just trying to. I
no,
said
no.
when you're saying that something is changed, or you're saying something is static, I'm trying to clarify. Well, it seemed a moment ago you said the record. Just now you said the recording was static, but I thought your previous argument is that something has changed. But it seems like that something has nothing to do with the recording.
It's our relation to the recording. And I think
Okay.
that's one of the things that Gould is
Okay.
getting at, right? Is
Okay.
that we are able to bring music from a different time
Mm-hmm.
that had a very specific way of being done. And this is to your point, right? Like could this song be re-recorded and reimagined? Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
one of the nice things that recording gives us is the ability to
Mm-hmm.
hear what was originally done
Mm-hmm.
and then respond to that on a new recording if you want. But
Mm-hmm.
my point is that because we have this artifact from this
Mm-hmm.
time, we can revisit it now and we see that moment through a different
Mm-hmm.
lens.
Mm-hmm.
That lens is going to be very different. Like I don't think that if you were to go into a high school and play that song now, first of all, most of the kids there have never heard it before,
Sure.
right? But their response to it is going to be different than what it was when that was
Mm-hmm.
first released in the early 90s.
Yeah, I got your point, and I take your point. I'm just I'm pondering. I'm left wondering how important music is, or isn't it? Music doesn't. I'm remarking on the fact that music doesn't seem to be a very important part of this equation
Well, this
because
is background music. Remember, we're talking about this. We're talking about
that's
background music.
interesting.
And the
So Cop
hallmark of,
Killer is now background music because we've lost the social. Is that your argument?
well, I'm certainly not saying it's background music, but the point is though
Mhm.
that one of the hallmarks of background music is its ability to be ignored and stripped of its identifying characteristics.
I think that's your argument, actually. I think your argument is that Cop Killer,
Could be.
absent, absent, minus the particular historical configuration of racial politics in the 1990s.
Right.
We have different configurations of racial antagonism and racial and class warfare in 2023, similar but different. And in absence of that particular configuration of racial aesthetic struggle, the song becomes background. Cop Killer,
It could.
a huge thing, that's become background music. And that would also explain why the sound of the record, what I was getting at here, that please,
Yeah,
I
yeah, yeah.
wasn't doing hostile question. I wasn't doing hostile. That
Oh,
wasn't doing.
you were hostile, buddy.
No, I'm not a hostile guy, but I just was interesting listening to. I was interested listening to the ways in which sound kind of falls out of the equation,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
and because it falls out of the equation, and I think that maybe that's what I think that's your strongest point, is that when that one of the things that can happen when we lose chronology is that meaning, some of the social meanings and social configurations are lost,
Mm-hmm.
and the recording has to make connect on its own, and a lot of times it won't to
It
younger
can't.
listeners.
Right. Okay.
Do we want to? I don't know. Well, do you have a comment on that? Yeah.
No, I
I'm
think,
not trying to shut down your discussion. I'm just wondering whether or not music. I mean, paradoxically, I wonder if we're seeing the vulnerability of music in this particular,
well,
or
no,
sound in this.
I don't so much think of it as a vulnerability. I don't know that that's right, because
Mhm.
music is an evolutionary thing. It's going to be different. I mean, this whole argument is predicated upon the fact that time changes things,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
That
Mhm. Sure is,
if
absolutely.
chronology matters, then there is evolution.
Mhm.
Uh,
Mhm.
so I don't think that it's a weakness. I think that it's the recognition that it's going to change, and that those changes have a forward as well as a backwards reaching effect. So,
I love that point. That's definitely part of the ambient. That's part. I mean, what you just said there is a wonderful statement, a wonderful takeaway from Gould, um, which is that uh, the past and future are reconfigured in the present moment
mhm.
through our interactions with the media environment, the musical environment afforded by sound recording. How about I add something to the background music discussion, and then we can sail off into the sunset.
Well, let's go.
I just and this is in keeping with the passage you are talking about, the greater affordances, the greater strengths, competencies, training of the listener. And this is in relation to, and this is one of the pressure moments in prophetic moment, even with Glenn Gould, because if you're a film buff, especially if you're a horror film buff, you're aware that the classic horror films of the 60s and 70s also are, especially now, they're regarded as monuments in the history of recorded music and of modern composition. Bernard Herrmann soundtracks for The Shining, soundtracks for 2001: A Space Odyssey, sci-fi in that case, sci-fi film in that case, or soundtracks for Psycho. These allowed so under in the guise of background music, the film soundtrack incredibly complex, daringly avant-garde compositions were sort of presented to audiences who assimilated them, as par for the course. There was no shock of, oh my God, that music is so disturbing. No. Or that music is formally so innovative, and I'm shocked to hear these sounds. No, you just internalize them along with the visuals, and that constituted a kind of education. The other passage, another resonance in the passage you read earlier, Michael, was the, the passage you read earlier pointed this out. There's a kind of greater eclecticism, a willingness to tolerate or accommodate different kinds of musical styles from different periods within our own present moment. We're bravely eclectic. Think about your playlist, or I mean, I look at student. I did you have students share with you their? I had several students share with me. They were so proud of their Spotify. What is that happened at the end of the end of the year event with Spotify?
I
Do you
don't know.
remember the title of it?
No.
There's an end of the year event where they tell you what you've listened to the
Oh,
most.
yeah.
And they kind of give you a chronological record of your listening. And I had several students sort of share with me like, oh, their playlists, and they were so proud of their playlists, as they should be. Here was the one thing all their different playlists had in common. They were all and this is totally Gould. They were mind-blurringly eclectic. And in terms of chronology, they would zoom from 20s, 30s to a contemporary performer, something done that year. So the ways in which they seamlessly, effortlessly negotiated stylistic gaps, genre differences, that's exactly what Gould is talking about.
This is one of his arguments, right? That
Yeah, it's
the music
absolutely
is
his
a
argument.
background music creates a much more complex listener because you have to be.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And so that was, I think, the upshot of the passage you read earlier.
Yeah.
I'm just going to add one to them.
Mm-hmm.
One more passage to this is where he talks specifically about and he turns out to be right here as well because of the subsequent reevaluation we now think that the soundtrack to The Shining or the soundtrack to Psycho is in its own way as much of a artistic landmark as the film in a different, obviously in a different medium. And he's making this point. He caught on to this at the time, which is a point to be applauded on Mr. Gould's behalf. We can applaud Mr. Gould for that. On the other hand, he writes, the musical backgrounds of many grade B horror thrillers coming out of Hollywood exploit advanced idioms, musical idioms. As background material, some significant scores as a result, as background material, this nonetheless, we call it background material and we say it's lacking in aesthetic value. But actually, his point is, as background material, quote, some significant scores find their way into the listening experience of an audience that would almost certainly avoid them as concert music. So background music, getting to your point, is part of this larger, okay, this might be the agenda you were speaking of. There is a kind of unconscious literacy that comes with the media environment, pushing everyone to this greater eclecticism, to a tolerance of musical styles, adventurous musical styles that they may not effortlessly consume otherwise.
Right. No, I think there's certainly the argument about exposure. And I wonder if maybe another aspect of this is that because so much of this music is stripped of its identifying characteristics, right? Like we don't have date as a concern. We don't have, one of his arguments in here is that for background music to function, really the producing behind it is all nameless, right? The time, like,
yes, right.
And so it becomes this unrecognizable thing, which I think makes it that much easier for us to engage with it because it is something that we can't subject to our natural prejudice. Like I don't like this. It becomes more, so it becomes something we can identify with through other markers than we would normally engage with. Yeah, I think I don't know that we really did the background music section of this justice, because it is incredibly interesting, but it's also very complex in the sense that he's pulling on a number of different
Well, how
things.
how about we conclude about, I mean, I agree with you. I felt like there were a lot of riches here and we barely tapped it. But maybe let's see if we can do two or three brief takeaways. Like, what would we recommend readers to look for if they look at the essay? Because we are recommending that if you're interested in these subjects, that you take a look at this essay. So, number one, pay attention to the art. We would suggest that you pay attention to the closing arguments about background music. Pay attention to what he's saying about the ways in which our consciousness of history change in relation to the new sonic environment provided by sound recordings. And what's our other big takeaway? The new power of the listener.
The power of the listener, I think, and really that and this is something that resonates well, given where music has gone since he
Mhm.
wrote it, is that the way that really the relation among, producers and performers
Consumers,
and
yeah, yeah,
listeners,
yeah.
that the thing that we didn't get to that I think is unfortunate, but the ship has sailed, is really the listener fulfilling all of these roles. And
Yes, right.
one of the connections, and I don't know why I keep going back to, like, pardon me, the 90s, and I guess in this case the really several years prior, um, is the ability, like, we didn't talk, one of the things that we've talked about tangentially here, but the idea of the mixtape or the underground tape.
Mhm,
Again, obviously it is a recorded artifact, but
mhm,
that as being an entirely new thing. And so I think
mhm,
that
mhm.
if I was going to say, hey, what really sort of rang my bell here is that the creation of the listener as now an active agent in producing the music. I
Very
found
good.
that to be
Yeah.
very interesting.
Yeah, no, it is. And my final sentence, I'm going to try to keep this down to a sentence or two. My final take on this and why this is an important essay to read is he doesn't describe technologies. He doesn't describe streaming technologies. He doesn't describe playlists or mixtapes, right? It's not future oriented. This isn't a future oriented essay in that sense. He doesn't predict or the exact features of our um, contemporary digital musical environment. But what I think he does, and this is a spectacular thing to have accomplished, in his description of the ways in which our interface with sound recordings has transformed our consciousness, he basically, I think he's making this incredible argument, or latent in this essay is this incredible argument that already the particulars of our digital streaming environment, our encounters with music in the digital world, in a way, those things we take for granted in our new musical environment, the contemporary musical environment, they are always latent in recording, in the sound recording process. There is a way in which digital technology cashed the checks that less advanced analog technologies of sound recording were kind of doing.
Mhm.
And what's changed? These technologies changed in relation to our desire, the listener, listener competences, and they fed them. So there's been this kind of feeding synergy going on between the development of digital technologies were developed and are being developed in order to augment the musical literacies and training, the literacies that we've been talking about.
Yeah,
So that's fascinating.
yeah, no, it really, this is, I wouldn't, I have nothing to add beyond that. I think that he doesn't speak directly to, good Lord, I'm sorry, to our moment, but it lines up beautifully. And I
It
think
lines
that's
up
it.
beautifully. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, that's it. That's a perfect way to say it.
All right. Well,
Well, thank you,
Barry, thank
Michael.
you. I enjoyed this one. I think this was really an interesting article, and I think it's worth a read for those of you who aren't familiar with it already.
I would agree. And it's a pleasure as always. We'll do it again.
Absolutely, Barry. See you soon.
Bye bye.
Bye.
Thanks for listening to the Critical Media Studies podcast. To find out more about the show, check out our webpage at criticalmediastudiespodcast.com.